I would like to welcome everyone this morning to our webinar on digitizing considerations for caps, beanies, and puff embroidery. So this would be a very nice conversation to learn a bit more. And I would like to introduce, of course, Steve Freeman, who is one of the managing partners at QDigitizing, where they focus on primarily delivering award-winning digitizing services for the North American, that's the US and Canada market primarily. Steve, let's start by giving us a short introduction. Please give people a little background on what you do.
Well, hey, good morning, everybody. It's nice to digitally see you all again. This is our second webinar in a series that we hope to do more regularly. So QDigitizing has been the entity that it is since 2008. We've digitized well over 500,000 designs by now. We look forward to doing 500,000 more in the next few years. I've personally been a digitizer since 1988. I taught myself how to program in the Melco world using a Digitrack. For any of you old timers out there, you might know what that is. But I'm also self-trained on Wilcom and Pulse systems. I've had the privilege to manage an embroidery floor with 1,100 embroidery heads. So I have been around the block.
You have indeed. 500,000 embroiderers later, and we are now sat here. I believe you would be considered an expert in your field.
Well, my head still has to get through the door, so don't call me that.
Fair enough, fair enough. Okay, so today, in our last webinar, just for those who didn't join us, we talked about embroidery in general and some of the considerations that people should take, when they are sending their files over to QDigitizing. So today, we're following up. We're talking about caps, we're talking about beanies, and puff embroidery. So Steve, let's start with, I see you've got 3 wonderful examples on screen already. I suppose the objective of our webinar is to inform, educate our audience on some of the considerations that you would like them to take into consideration, that you would like them to consider before they send artwork over to you, and what sort of results you can get based on what you receive and the instructions on what you receive as well from them. So what's the most important thing that one should consider when doing embroidery on a cap? That's my first question for you.
Okay, so the single most important thing to consider when doing cap embroidery is the artwork that you're going to be presenting to QDigitizing to program for you, and how that is going to transfer to the embroidery medium, ultimately to stitch on your machine. So on your screens right now, you can see 3 examples of designs we've received recently. And these are very common for the type of things that we see. And each one of them has a challenge to itself that's specific to cap embroidery. All 3 of these designs, depending on the size that they're programmed, could be done for apparel, flat apparel. But when you're limited by the size constraint of caps, the art itself becomes very limiting. So,
right. So Steve, if we look at these 3 designs, I mean, for me, when I look at Home Pro, I think it's a great design. What is the challenge with that particular one that you think you'd face if you received that?
So the Home Pro is a beautiful design. The problem with it is the distressed effect or the brush font that's being used to create the letters. The face of the letter itself is fine. However, all of those small white details that are in the lettering simply do not transfer well to embroidery because of the resolution challenges that the medium has. We can't digitize those and have them come out clean, because in reality, what you see as white inside the orange, gray, and black is not really embroidery. That's actually would be the fabric of the cap showing through.
Right, right. So you can't deliver something. You can't deliver a clean, sharp, or perfect digitizing output on that. What about American Eagle? That one seems pretty straightforward to me.
The American Eagle logo itself is beautiful, except for the small text Citizen Trust. At cap size, that font at that size is not going to stitch well. And by the way, the operative word here is stitch well, or operative words, is
So it's stitch well, yes.
stitch well. Because we can do it, it just depends on the quality output that you want at the end of the day.
So it's all about the quality. Now, if we look at or the next one, it seems to me, I mean, again, the font is much larger. The artwork is very clear. What's the challenge with a design like this?
So the problem with this design is just going to be too much stuff in too small of a place. And again, we have resolution issues with embroidery. The small text at the bottom is simply not going to stitch well when this design is embroidered at 2.25 inches tall. Typically 2.25 is what we consider to be the maximum height for a cap. Some people can go up to 2.5 inches, but even at 2.5, that text is not going to stitch well. And then there's also that little logo on the inside of the shirt. It's just not going to look good. So
Right, so you're talking about all the little logo in there, you can't get that. So these three are not. What solution then would you suggest?
So as the digitizers, we do want to be able to offer solutions to you. Okay. So, here, these are three choices, how we would maybe present to you for how we can fix these designs. Okay. The Home Pro, you can clearly see that we've removed all of the distressing. This will now stitch beautifully, no problem whatsoever. American Village, we've moved the text below, and then we've simplified the text to be a sans serif Arial type font. And then we've also moved the text ILLAGE in Village down, just because it would look weird if it was up where it used to be, since we moved the text down. And then for the Fauché Learning Center, what we've done is we've actually changed it quite a bit. And remember, these are just suggestions that we would offer to you for how to fix or to how to make these more embroiderable for you. Ultimately, this is going to provide superior embroidery for you and your customer, with our goal, and hopefully your goal, is to get repeat customers, because the better the quality that we do for you, hopefully you'll come back and continue to use our services. And the same goes for the customers that you serve. The better quality embroidery you provide them, the more often they'll come back to you.
So essentially, Steve, I think this comes down to a bit of branding as well. So you would need permission from your customers for you to be able to make these changes, obviously. So you need them to communicate with you. How would that work out?
We would never make these changes without the customer's approval. So when we get artwork that has problems with it for cap embroidery, we will put the artwork on hold and we'll offer suggestions to the customer saying, can we do this or can we do that to make the design work for you? And then, depending on the answer to the questions we ask, we'll proceed accordingly.
I've got a question. So when a customer, let's say, they come onto your website, they want to submit an artwork, is there in the form, can they send you specific instructions as well, so you can get the embroidery done in the first go?
Absolutely. On our web-based order forms, there's a box that basically says order comments. In that box, you can freeform enter as much information as you want. So, for example, let's go back a slide. Let's say a customer uploads the order called Home Pro, and then in the order comment box, they can simply say something like, "Please remove the distressed effect and punch and program the logo for us." If you put that in the order comments, then your result is going to look like this, okay? If you don't put that in the order comments, you're going to receive a hold message from us that says, please advise how we can treat the distressed effects because we can't program that for you at cap size.
Got it. Got it. Makes perfect sense. So in terms of considerations, if I were to summarize, we're looking at artwork. You need very good resolution, good quality artwork for you to get good quality outcomes. We're looking at in terms of the size. What's the maximum size that you can do? 2.5, did you say?
2.5 is the maximum. 2.25 inches is kind of like a generally accepted rule. And that pretty much covers it. Hey, if I could just, since you asked, if I could add one thing, the order comment box that we mentioned just a moment ago, that box is an incredibly wonderful tool, but in that box, don't ask us questions. That box is meant to give us information, not ask questions. The reason for that being is my team members that are going to first review that box are not in a position to communicate with you directly. So if you ask a question in that box, it's a 100% guarantee that your order will go on hold. The reason for that is that order is going to be brought immediately to my attention or my assistant Flora, so we can then reach out to you and answer the question that you've asked.
Got it. Very important to remember. Right then, Steve, shall we move on? Any further considerations that you would like to highlight?
Not at this point. Maybe customers or attendees will have questions when we get to the Q&A.
Okay.
So moving on to the next.
Right. So now we've got Bobcat and we've got Dawson. What, based on what we've learned so far, how do you apply these here? What considerations are we looking at? What special considerations are we looking at here?
So primarily for cap embroidery, one of the rules of thumb that we go by, and one of the rules of thumb that many people seem to be quite aware of, is the rule to stitch from the bottom up and center out. What that does is that technique kind of, it forces the cap to be it pushes the cap outward, okay? And it allows the logo not to bunch the cap up in the middle. This is a beautiful technique and we use it all the time, and we want customers to know that, we are certainly aware of it. So if you look at a design like Bobcat of Brainerd, we know that we're going to put this on caps. We are going to start at the bottom of Brainerd. We're going to stitch that text. Typically we go from the A in BRA to the O in of, and then we go from the I, so it's, ARBFO and then INERD. And then we move up to the top, and then we go little b to big B, and then the word cat from CAT. So that gives us the bottom up, center out. And then we program
center out. Would you be able to do that with Dawson? Where would be the bottom up and center out with Dawson? Or is that not possible at all? It doesn't seem like it to me.
So the issue with logos like Dawson, and we get a lot of these, and then customers will often ask us, well, how come you didn't program this one bottom up, center out? Well, the issue is the way the design is layered, it does not allow for a bottom up, center out technique. So if you watch this design actually stitch out, you'll see that the first thing it does is it shows that the bottom fill, okay? And then it does the black border, then the white border, and then it comes in to do the text. Now, a logo like this, once that bottom fill has been, once the bottom detail has been filled and bordered, that kind of supersedes center out at that point.
Now, because it's already sturdy, I suppose.
Yes, the hat has already been stabilized at that point. So the rest of the logo can pretty much be done traditionally. We still want to go bottom up, but we don't necessarily have to go center out at that point. We could, and you know, when I look at a design like this and a customer brings it to my attention, what I'll say to them is, after the fact, I'll explain it, and then I'll say, if you'd like, we can certainly program Dawson and Dental LLC center out as well. However, and that is a toothbrush down there, the toothbrush at that point has stabilized the cap.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I don't know if you've got any other further comments on this, but I want to, in one of our conversations, you were talking about, we discussed the fact that it has become very popular as well for people to only do one panel of a hat when they're embroidering. Am I jumping ahead a bit here?
We jumped ahead a little bit, but that's okay. We can come back because a lot of these topics actually kind of combine with each other. So nowadays, it's become very popular for customers, our customers, and of course their customers, to embroider on only one side of the cap. So that presents some special considerations that need to be considered. That's interesting. Anyways, the main one being is the width of your design becomes significantly reduced. You know, when you embroider a logo on the front of a cap, if you have one of the 270-degree cap frames, you can go as wide as 14 inches on your design, okay? But traditional cap embroidery, let's say that your maximum width is 5.5 inches would be your maximum width. However, if you're going to stitch on only one panel of the cap, your maximum width becomes 2.75 inches. Now, some people will say, well, from seam to seam, it's 3 inches. Well, that's true. However, if you look at the back side of your hat, you'll see you have all that material that forms the center seam and the side seam. So that reduces the size of the logo really to 2.75 inches wide maximum. So in this case, that small text, make your mouth happy, just simply is not going to stitch well or stitch legibly. So our advice to the customer becomes, the kinfolk cooking is the main part of this logo. Let's do that on the panel of the hat. And for this project, we would advise you delete make your mouth happy.
Exactly. So again, it comes back down to the number one consideration in terms of size. It's the size of the text.
Correct.
It's very important. You can't digitize when it's so small.
Is it okay if we go back a couple of slides
let's go back. Yeah, one or two.
Okay. So, you know, as we're moving through these topics for caps, the number one issue we run into all the time
Small text.
is small text. Okay. When a design is requested for a cap, we're always looking at this, whatever the smallest text is in the design controls everything else in the design. So unless we deal with that text, then we really can't program the design well for you. So we have two designs here. The North Bay Brokerage. The small text in the center, decorative rocks, soils, and barks, that simply has to go. Okay, it is not going to stitch well at cap size. And that's just a fact.
It just won't happen. Simply, it just won't happen.
And then Florida Atlantic University, if everything is kept in proportion, okay, that text is not going to stitch well in that font. So we might ask the customer, but that's also a very important part of the design. So it's not like we can just rip it out and everyone's going to be happy. So we will typically have to ask the customer if we can simplify the font, change that Times New Roman type font to a sans serif Arial type font. And if we can do that, we can typically make, you know, the design work for you. We might also have to make that text a little bit bigger. The main point here, though, is we have to consider the small text. Just have to.
Steve, I know you might have that in there, but I was thinking as well in terms of the design, can you not move some of the text perhaps to the back of the cap, or are these considerations or options that you might present to clients?
We might. Some logos, like the North Bay, they very well might want to move decorative rock soils and barks, to the back of the cap. But if we go back a couple more slides again, here at Fauché Learning Center, since you're not going to get better every day on the front of the cap, our suggestion was to move it to the back of the hat. And you could still even add the cute little character, but you could do the tagline, get better every day.
At the back of the cap, exactly.
There's always options. The main thing to just consider is you have to consider the small text and how it's going to impact the quality of your embroidery.
So small text, but there are options, there are solutions, but it's a matter of communicating that. And so if the client sends you the artwork and it's already good to go, it gets through in the first go, but you're saying if it's not ready, you'll have to put the order on hold and then communicate with the client to find a solution.
That's correct.
Excellent. Right then, Steve, shall we move on?
Sure. So everybody out there that's watching this is probably familiar with that gosh darn seam in the middle of the cap. Okay.
Looks like a broken needle about to happen to me.
It can be, and the seam in the middle of the cap, that groove, the Grand Canyon going right down the middle, is a problem in and of itself. But there's also all that material that's on either side of that seam on the back side of the cap that you can't see. I kind of call that the on-ramp and the off-ramp to the Grand Canyon. Okay. So even though you can't see the on-ramp and the off-ramp, they are there.
It is there.
It is there. And when you're actually embroidering that cap, it's very much like your car going through a pothole going down the road. Okay. So, I like to use this analogy because I think everybody has driven through a pothole at some point in their life.
I believe we all have.
Right. And when your car goes through that pothole, you feel it. Okay, you can't pretend that you don't feel it. You feel a big bump in your car and it shakes and nobody really likes it and you're worried that you're going to break your car and all that kind of fun stuff. Well, when your embroidery machine goes over that seam, it is the exact same thing.
So your solution.
So there's a couple different solutions. Okay, one of them, we can remediate the problem by building a bridge on top of the seam. Now, the example that you're seeing here doesn't work in all cases, but in the cases it can work, it's a beautiful solution. We actually build a bridge over the seam, and in this case, there's a fill, which then goes on top of that bridge, and then the design is actually on top of that fill.
And so now it's stable. And now
that works very well. Stables the heck out of the cap. So, but then a lot of designs don't have a fill behind them, so we have to invent a bridge, okay? And then typically the way that works is there'll be a fairly light density fill that we put behind. In this case, I'm just using small text as an example, because what happens here, the red line that you can see in the middle, that is the center of the cap. That is where the seam would be, okay? As your machine is stitching over that seam, that left side of the D, the vertical bar, is going to fall down into the seam. There's nothing you can do about that. That's not bad digitizing. It's not bad embroidery technique. It's the Grand Canyon is there and you have to deal with it.
It's there.
So, what we try and do is put a fill. If a customer will allow us, we'll put a fill behind the design or behind the text, and then the text will stitch on top. It raises it up off the hat, and the seam itself is taken out of play. Now, for larger letters, you may not need a bridge, okay? But for smaller letters, oftentimes that is really the only effective solution for best quality embroidery. And please remember, these things are all subjective. We don't have to put a bridge behind there, but if that D falls into the Grand Canyon and you don't like the way it looks, we don't really have a solution for that unless we do something like this.
Okay, brilliant. Steve, I think we need to crack on because we're already, it's almost half an hour in. Let's move on to beanies, knit beanies. Now, of course, being stretchy and I suppose it's definitely more difficult to do. What should people take into consideration?
The most important thing to consider with knit beanies is the material itself. Okay, knit beanies are thick and they stretch. Okay, so this is one of the areas where we need a perfect marriage between digitizing and embroidery technique so we can take the stretch out of the beanie. So we are going to use special techniques when we digitize the logo to minimize the impact of the stretch and the fabric compression. However, as the decorator or you giving instructions to the decorator, they need to make sure that they use proper backing techniques in order to stabilize the material. The
Right.
most
Let's talk about
important
the
thing,
backing techniques because that's a very good point there.
right? For the most part, you're not going to be able to use tearaway backings when embroidering on knit beanies. Um, but here's the problem, or the challenges, I should say. There's no such thing as one size fits all solutions. There are going to be times where, assuming that we do a good job on the digitizing for you, you still might need to experiment on the production side to provide the best quality embroidery possible. Like you might need to use a topping like a solvay, or you might find in one case a design needs two layers of cutaway backing instead of one layer of cutaway backing. There's more than one way to get to the finish line. The most important thing though, and this is of critical importance, okay, hypercritical importance. If you know you're going to be stitching on a knit beanie, you need to tell us, okay, because we are going to design or program your design differently for a knit beanie than we're going to for a regular cap, like a ball cap, or for traditional apparel. And of equal importance, that design is probably only going to work on a knit beanie at that point. Some
So
embroidery
it can be very
designs,
specific to the client, you're saying.
yes. And on our order forms, we do ask the type of fabric, and in this case, you're going to select other, and then in the box, you're gonna write knit beanie, and that will tell us what we need to know.
Are
Okay.
there some types that you just can't do at all?
So if we move to the next slide real quick, these are some additional considerations. The knit beanie that is on the far right side is probably not going to embroider very well, with one exception. Okay, if you put a knockdown fill on that knit beanie, which we'll talk about in the next slide, you could make it work. But without a knockdown fill, you are not going to be able to embroider well on that knit beanie. The weave is just too open. The stitches are going to fall through. The machine's not able to tie knots on the back side of the embroidery. The other two caps that are on here, we're going to talk about, size considerations again.
So the yellow cap, blue cap.
Right. The yellow cap on the left, it has a folded over hem, which many knit beanies do. When that's the case, whatever the size of that folded over hem is becomes your vertical limit. So if that hem is 2 inches tall, really you need a ½ inch on the bottom and a ½ inch on top to allow for hooping. So all of a sudden, that means your design maximum vertical height is 1 inch. Okay. Now, let's say that's a 3-inch hem and you want, a ½ inch on the top and a ½ inch on the bottom, then you have a little bit more space. The design on the blue cap, since there's no folded hem, you knock yourself out. You can use the whole front of that beanie if you want. It may or may not be advisable, but you can do it.
But you can do it much easier. And the one on the right, the nice gray one with the pom-pom on the top, just won't work.
It won't work unless you use a knockdown fill. So
Let's talk about the knockdown.
So very quickly, a knockdown fill is really kind of like a bridge, like we were talking about on the center seam for caps. It has a little bit different mission. And in this case, the mission is to knock down the pile and compress the fabric so that when you sew the logo on top of the knockdown fill, it provides a nice firm substrate in order for the logo to stitch on. You know, looking at these two images, the one on the left, the KW, you know, Keller Williams, that's a beautiful example of a knockdown fill. It's the stitching that's underneath there, it's black on black, so you can barely see that it's there, but it allows that design to stand up beautifully on top of that knockdown fill. The one on the right is actually, this is actually one of my favorite examples of a knockdown fill, but you know,
Looks like something you'd find at a high-end hotel in London.
right. And for full transparency, this one is not on a knit beanie. This was actually done on a terry cloth robe.
And
So
there you go.
somebody monogrammed this onto a terry cloth robe. But the knockdown fill is the exact same reason. What it does is it knocks down the pile of the terry cloth, so the monogram can be stitched on top of that knockdown fill and stand up on top of the material. It allows for a beautiful presentation.
Wonderful. Brilliant. Anything else regarding beanies before we move on to puff embroidery?
Not at this time. Again, if anybody has questions in Q&A, that'll be the place to ask them.
Brilliant. Let's carry on. Puff embroidery. Now, this is one of my favorite. I absolutely love this stuff that's coming out now.
So, you know, puff embroidery is incredibly popular right now. We get numerous requests every single day for digitizing for puff embroidery. So if anybody has the question out there, can you digitize for puff embroidery? The answer is absolutely yes. Okay. Now, as we mentioned at the start of the webinar, the most important thing to consider when doing puff embroidery is your art, because not all designs will puff well. Okay. Some designs simply are not well suited to puff embroidery, and we'll get into the reasons for that on the next slide. Okay, but for the most part, if you look at the designs on this page right here, let's take the Domino's Pizza logo first. Pretty much everyone in the US knows what the Domino's Pizza logo looks like.
We've got Domino's in the UK as well, Steve. Just
I guess I'm a little prejudiced because in my life before embroidery, I was actually a district manager for Domino's Pizzas, and I had 12 stores under my direct supervision. But anyways, moving on.
Moving on nicely. What can we do with Domino's?
The text Domino's Pizza and the three dots can be puffed, but you cannot puff the fills that are behind the text. And then if somebody just dumps this on us without any instructions, we then have to ask the question about the straight lines, because technically those could be puffed, but do you want them puffed? So it's really important in the instructions to tell us, hey, QDigitizing, we'd like this Domino's Pizza logo digitized for puff embroidery. Please puff the dots, the text. Those white lines that you see now, those are meant to be the cap showing through. If we get those instructions, we'll do a beautiful job for you every time. Okay. The lion that you see in the middle, simply not friendly to puff embroidery. It doesn't lend itself well to the technique. If you look at if you go over to the far right column and the third design down, underground, Wilford is very familiar with the underground, being from
Absolutely.
London, and Mind the Gap. The red circle and the blue bar should be flat embroidery with the text underground puffed on top. Now, you cannot stitch text on top of puff and have it look good. So that blue bar needs to be flat. Now, the red circle could be puffed, but from an objective standpoint, my recommendation would be the red circle should be flat, the blue bar should be flat, underground puff. So again, when you give us your instructions, please let us know that, because it'll help us get the design back to you more quickly and prevent us from putting it on hold. One more example, the MTV logo, that is in the bottom right corner.
Yeah.
The T and the V will puff beautifully. The M, for reasons we'll get into in just a moment, will not puff well, and neither will the small text music television. However, from a subjective standpoint, this is going to look really good if that TV is puffed. So moving on to the next slide, we'll talk about the limitations that we have.
So we're looking at, again, text size. That's always the challenge. It's the starting challenge is the size of the text.
For puff embroidery, the column width is actually what determines what can be done well and what can't be done well. The minimum column width for puff embroidery is 3 millimeters. The maximum is 12 millimeters. Now, before somebody tells me, I've seen puff embroidery with 20 millimeter columns. Yes, it is possible. However, it is machine specific. Not all machines can do it. And the machines that can do it, you need to know on your machine how to turn off the jump stitch solenoids when you're on the puff portion of the design. If you don't, what's going to happen is anything that's over 12 millimeters, your embroidery machine is going to see it as a jump stitch as opposed to, let's just call it a wide satin stitch, and you're going to get undesirable results.
Right, so 3 millimeters of 12 millimeters, that's our benchmark.
Correct. Unless you tell me, Steve, we know what we're doing, our machine can handle it, I want this to be, 15 millimeters wide, and we'll say, okay. And then we'll do it. Okay?
Okay.
And folks, I can really get into the weeds on this conversation, but right now we're kind of trying to give a high helicopter view to avoid too much detail. So if you have specific questions, please ask them in Q&A, or feel free to send me an email to service@QDigitizing.com. I promise I will answer all questions.
Wonderful. Moving on a little bit more, what other considerations when it comes to puff?
Okay, so this seems like it should be obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people have sent me designs, puff designs, where they had black text on top of white puff and they weren't happy because all the white was squishing out the sides. Whenever possible, it is really important to use the closest possible puff material to whatever your top thread is going to be. There are far more thread colors than there are puff colors. So just remember, do the best you can, as close as you can, and you're always going to get superior results.
Right. So thread color, very important to match with the puff material itself as closely as possible.
Okay.
That's an important piece of consideration right there.
It is, and it seems silly, but it comes up a lot. One other thing for success, and this is where the marriage between, digitizing and production comes into play. So when you're doing puff embroidery, you need to loosen the top tension just a little bit. That allows the machine to feed a little bit more thread, which allows your machine to better cover the puff embroidery. If your tension is too tight, it basically, it's like squeezing Jello at that point, and you're going to squeeze the Jello outside the borders of the puff embroidery. So many times, a customer will get a result similar to what you see in the hard rock, and they want us to add more density because, the assumption being the design isn't dense enough to cover up all the puff. Well, that may be, and we are certainly willing, to go back and add some density. However, oftentimes, we'll find, like I'll ask a customer, can you send me a picture of the backside of your embroidery? And then I look and I see a pattern like what you see on the left side of the screen there. And I say, well, we'll certainly add density, but please understand that you need to loosen your top tension. One thing for you Melco customers out there, as well as the Tajima customers that are using, the machines that have auto tensioning now, your machine does have settings that will allow the machine to feed a little bit more thread, down to the needle as you're stitching over the puff parts of your design. Make sure that you make those adjustments, because if you don't, you're not going to feed enough thread into the needle, and it will cause the puff material to pop out the sides like you're seeing here.
Wonderful. Steve, we're winding down. Any finishing techniques that you want to recommend before we move over into Q&A?
Yep, let's go over these real quickly. So even with the absolute 100% best puff embroidery ever done, puff embroidery often requires finishing techniques that aren't used in traditional embroidery. A certain amount is to be expected, Okay, so please understand it doesn't mean the digitizing is bad. It doesn't mean that your embroidery is bad. Some finishing is going to be required even on the best puff embroidery. So you'll see here that I've highlighted using tweezers to pull off, small pieces of puff material that might be poking out. And then, the final step might be using a heat gun. And what that does is it causes the puff material that's underneath the thread to contract a little bit. It pulls in and will allow ultimately to have a result that looks like this.
Brilliant.
Okay. And that is our goal. I mean, that is ultimately our goal. So this video right here actually shows, what we're considering when we create puff embroidery. So let me start this here. So with puff embroidery, we do things a little bit differently than with traditional embroidery, because with puff, we need to lay the foundation first, which is what you see happening in this video right now.
Right,
Okay.
so we get the foundations go in first, and then move on.
I'm sorry, I restarted that by accident. I hit the wrong button. This will just take a second.
That's fine. Yeah, let it run.
So I want to pause right here. And the reason I'm pausing is one huge difference between puff embroidery and traditional embroidery is the borders go down first, and then you do the puff embroidery. With pretty much every other type of embroidery that's done, the fill goes down first and then the border, but that is not the case with puff embroidery.
Looking good.
Okay, once the border is laid down, then we stop the machine, we put the puff material in place, an underlay is put in place that helps to stabilize and cut the material. And you can see at the end that you still need to do some finishing. We pull out the center pieces and you have a nice, beautiful puff embroidery done.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Steve. And now we will move over into our Q&A. Please, if you've got any questions, you can raise your digital hands. Just click on the button, raise hand. You can see mine there, and I will come to you. So who'd like to go first? Mary Branch, how did you fill the Grand Canyon when the D letter was just touching the edge?
Can you say that again?
So Mary typed in, said, how did you fill the Grand Canyon when the D letter was just touching the edge?
Well, the fill is going to be in place regardless of what might be on top of the Grand Canyon, so to speak. There are other techniques that can be used there. For instance, let's say that instead of a D, there was a lowercase I right on top of the Grand Canyon. Without the bridge, that I is going to fall into the Grand Canyon. There's nothing you can do about it. So if you don't build a bridge, one thing that you can do in the design work itself is artificially move the letter I either just to the left or just to the right of the center of the design. That might make the design look not exactly 100% like the art, but it will become important because of the scene consideration.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. If there's any other question you've got, you can type it, or you can also ask your questions live. Just raise your digital hand and we'll come to you. All right. Anyone else? I can see
we have a
we've got Amit asking, do you also run the design center out even for a cap back design?
Typically no, because that's treated as a flat at that point. If you prefer that we program it for you that way, we absolutely would. You would add that to your order comments and ask for center out on the cap back as well. The big difference between stitching on the back of the cap and stitching on the front of the cap is the back of the cap is hooped flat, and when you're stitching on the front of the cap, you are embroidering on a curved surface and using a hat frame.
All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. That question has been answered.
One other thing though, on a cap back, you might have the same bridge issue though, because there will be a seam in the middle. So we still might have to take that into account.
Okay, lovely. Any other questions? Anyone else? We've got quite a few people here. Okay. Well, if we do not have any other questions, I believe we can draw this to a close. It has been fun once again. Hang on, I see a hand. There you go. Let's go with Henning. Please unmute yourself.
Good. Can you hear me?
We
Yes.
can hear you.
When I request a quote, do you provide the stitch count at that time of a design?
Yes, we do. If you use either our web-based form for quote request, or if you send us an email, we're always going to provide a stitch count quote.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Brilliant. Any other questions, Henning?
No.
That's
Not
it.
at this time. Thanks.
No, thank you. All right, anyone else? I believe I see a question here. One last question. Let me see. It says, sorry, one last question from me. Since I run into problems regularly, what's the minimum text size you recommend? Minimum text size.
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question. Okay. So, generally speaking, the rule of thumb in the wonderful world of commercial embroidery is a quarter-inch text. Quarter-inch text is actually kind of large. So I like to actually say 4 millimeters, which is also 0.20 of an inch. Now, the problem there is not so much the size of the text, it is the type of the text. Does it have a serif like Times New Roman, or is it a block text like Arial, which does not have any serifs? If you are a sans serif font, you can typically go smaller with your text than you can with a serif font. The other thing to consider is this, and this is actually super duper critical, okay?
Super duper critical. There we go.
The smallest stitch that you can make with your embroidery machine and do it well cannot be smaller than the diameter of your needle, okay? So if your needle has a 1 millimeter diameter, you can't form stitches that are smaller than 1 millimeter, okay? It doesn't work, okay? So there are tips and tricks that you can do to get smaller text. You can use a 60 weight thread. You can even go all the way down to an 80 weight thread if you want. But there's a couple of issues that you need to consider when you do that. If you're going to use a 60 weight thread, then you need to go down to a smaller needle. It does not get you anything if you use 60 weight thread, but you still use a 7511 needle. If you're going to use 60 weight thread, then you have to use a smaller needle like a 65.9. You have to. If that's sorry, because people hate to change their needles on their machine, and I don't blame them, okay, because it's kind of a pain in the rear end. But if you want to use 60 weight thread, you have to use smaller needles. Otherwise, there's no point. The other thing to consider is this: if you want to use 60 weight thread, there are far, far, far fewer colors of 60 weight thread than there are of the typical embroidery thread, which is a 40.
Very good point. Thank you very much. And now we move over to Ashley, who's asking, are there any special settings on the software that will help with puff? Any special settings on the software that will help with puff? That's from Ashley.
So that's a really good question. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is it is specific to the software title being used. every one of the major software applications out there has different, I'm just going to call them different features that you can employ, depending on what you may be doing for the actual digitizing. The primary thing with puff embroidery is we're going to alter the densities that we use for the top stitching. We're also going to alter the densities that we use for underlay. Those two things, more than anything, will help to provide for nice, beautiful top puff embroidery. And the other thing too is, and I'm kind of kicking myself in the fanny right now, I should have included a slide, and I might be able to show you one here. Let's see. Actually, let's go to this one. The way that you digitize, you have to cap, we call it capping the letters. So and you guys can't see me pointing at my screen with my finger. That's kind of simple. So
we can see the cursor though.
Oh, you can see the cursor. Okay.
We can see the cursor.
This area right in here, the way that this is embroidered for flat embroidery is very different than how you embroider that for flat embroidery. The same goes here. Anywhere that you see that an open end of embroidery for puff embroidery is actually digitized very differently than how you might digitize for traditional embroidery. So, oh, what happened there? So it's not so much the machine settings as the digitizers themselves using very specific techniques for puff embroidery.
Okay, fantastic. And we've got another question here from Kenyon. And his question is, when doing puff, do I need to add end caps?
That's what we were just discussing, the end caps. But we do that in the digitizing. That's not something you should be doing on your side. If you need to add end caps, then we've goofed up for you.
Okay, brilliant. So there are two questions, same questions on end caps. I believe that is, yeah, both of them answered.
So
any other questions?
If I could interject something there, sometimes customers will try and use designs that were not programmed specifically for puff embroidery on puff embroidery, and it won't work. Because for one reason, it won't have those end caps, and those end caps are critical to puff embroidery.
Okay, and Molly, I can answer this question for you. Says, will the session be available to view after it ends? I missed a few parts that I wanted to see. Yes, it will be available. Steve and his team will be sending it out by email. I believe that you can watch it. So brilliant. Any other questions? Well, I would like to say thank you very much, Steve, for your enlightening discussion this morning on digitizing for caps, beanies, and puff embroidery, and for everyone who joined us. And I look forward, as I'm sure everyone else is, looking forward to the next session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Bye.